On this episode of NorCal News Now, we're speaking with California Insurance Commissioner and State Attorney General candidate Dave Jones. I'm your co-host, Mike Richman.
And I'm political consultant Aaron Haar.
Yes, you are political consultant and co-host Aaron Haar. With a nice hat on, I noticed. Thank you, Aaron, for doing that.
All right.
All right. Our guest on today's show is the Insurance Commissioner for the state of California, an important office that he's held for more than 7 years. Earlier in his political career, he was a member of the Sacramento City Council and then served 3 terms in the California State Assembly. In this election cycle, he's running for California Attorney General. So, Dave Jones, welcome to NorCal News Now.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for joining us via Skype. We appreciate you giving us some time today. It's a rainy day here in Northern California. We want to get into it with you a little bit about a multitude of issues, legal and otherwise, that are confronting our state. There's certainly a lot to get to. But first, on our show, we like to kind of get behind the scenes of the candidates a little bit. So maybe find out a little bit about who Dave Jones really is. So maybe we can start by letting you tell us, what's your idea of a perfect day? What would be your perfect day in Dave Jones's world?
A perfect day would be camping and hiking with my family, my wife, Kim Flores, and my son, William, and daughter, Isabel Flores Jones, in one of California's many splendid outdoor parks, or maybe in a national park in California. We've got so many beautiful places to visit, and we like to camp and we like to hike, and it's a great part of living in California.
Yeah, it sure is. I'm a New Jerseyan myself, New Jerseyite. I don't know exactly what the term is for us guys from Jersey, but you get out to California if you've been anywhere out east in particular, and it's a pretty special place. I think that's part of what we're all trying to do here is keep it special both environmentally as well as politically as well, right?
That's absolutely correct. It is a special place in terms of our people, the diversity of our people, their ingenuity, their creativity, the multiple ways in which people from diverse communities have added value and made contributions. And then, of course, topography, geography, climate, it's all here. And it's a great state, and we don't want the new Trump administration to mess it up.
Yeah, boy, that's kind of subtext of everything we're talking about these days, isn't it? I mean, that administration of ours and it's our administration. Hey, even if we didn't vote for it, it's ours because we're all Americans. But California and the federal government right now are kind of going at it on a couple of levels. And that's one thing that you certainly would have to deal with as an incoming Attorney General of the state of California.
Well, that's right. A big part of the job of Attorney General now is defending California from the onslaught by the Trump administration, whether it's attacks on our immigrant community, attacks on women's access to reproductive health care, trying to undermine health care reform, seeking to drill off our coasts, seeking to undermine national monuments that preserve important habitat, going after the LGBT community and transgender persons, going after labor organizations. It's a long list. So it's all hands on deck in terms of the fight. And what I bring to that fight is over 30 years experience as a practicing lawyer, someone who's been leading for the last 7.5 years a statewide law enforcement and consumer protection agency, and experience at the local, state, and federal levels, including 3 years as Janet Reno's special assistant in Washington, D.C. when she was the United States Attorney General, where I saw firsthand how to run a large Department of Justice. So I am very well prepared and well qualified. I feel that I've been preparing all of my public interest legal career for this position, and I'm excited at the prospect of leading that office.
Yeah, Dave, since 2011, you've been the Insurance Commissioner of California. And, I'm not really sure what that is. I was going to say, tell everybody who doesn't know what that is, but I'm not going to lie. I'm not sure what that is. It says on here, we don't have a cell phone commissioner. We don't have a car commissioner, car insurance commissioner. So what is it that insurance commissioner does?
It's a consumer protection and law enforcement agency, an independent one. So I don't report to the governor or lieutenant governor or any of the other statewide elected officials. I report to you, the voters of California. And the office was set up as a statewide elected office, as an independent regulatory agency to protect consumers and businesses in their interactions with insurance companies. Insurance companies collect $322 billion a year in premium from us. And you think about it, each and every one of us has and needs insurance, whether it's auto insurance, life insurance, health insurance, business insurance, you name it, all these different insurance products. And the bargaining position between you as a consumer and the insurance companies, well, it's simply not equal. So the job of insurance commissioner is to protect consumers in their interactions with insurance companies, make sure the insurance companies follow through on the promises they make. It's also a law enforcement agency. I have sworn peace officers that investigate all sorts of white-collar crimes, and we work closely with the district attorneys to prosecute those crimes. In fact, I grant about $60 million a year to the DAs to prosecute the crimes we investigate. We regulate the rates of auto and property insurance. I've saved consumers over $3 billion in that work. And by going to bat for consumers, we've returned over $464 million to consumers in their disputes with insurance companies. So it's a big job, a big regulatory agency. Thankfully, I have 1,400 very talented public servants that help me do the work, and we're very aggressive in our protection of consumers.
So, Dave, you had a front row seat to the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, many would call it. And you've watched, as we all have, as the Trump administration has really tried to dismantle that program. Through both administrations, I think, however, we've seen as consumers' health care costs go up. So there were and have been a lot of promises of cost savings. We haven't necessarily seen them transpire, any of us. So can you talk a little bit about your perspective on this issue and what we as consumers can hope for from healthcare costs in the future?
I have been one of the statewide leaders that's been leading the implementation of healthcare reform, literally from the moment I was sworn in as insurance commissioner, where I issued an emergency regulation requiring the insurers to put 85 or 80% respectively of their premiums into actual healthcare. And healthcare reform, while not perfect, has helped a lot of people in California. We've insured 5 million additional people who didn't have insurance before. And most of them are getting a significant subsidy. If they're on Medi-Cal, these are very low-income individuals who otherwise were not getting any health insurance. Now they're getting Medi-Cal at a very, very, very subsidized price, in some cases for free. And if they're buying through our exchange, about 85% of the 1.2 million individuals who are buying through our exchange are getting a dramatic subsidy as well as limitations on their out-of-pocket costs. So it did help a lot of people. Some people did experience insurance price increases. If you're someone that makes more money than people that were eligible for the things I've described, you might have seen a health insurance rate increase. Now, I've tried to get legislation and a ballot measure passed to give me the authority to regulate those rates. That sadly was not a part of the compromise of the Affordable Care Act, so I tried to get that enacted here in California. And unfortunately, the health insurers spent $50 million lying about the ballot measure in 2014 up and down the state, and so the voters didn't enact it. So that is one of the missing pieces of the reform, is actual direct regulation of rates. In terms of underlying medical costs, initially in the Obama administration, in aggregate, there was a slowing of the increase in aggregate medical costs, but that effect seems to be wearing off, particularly as the Trump administration tries to undermine healthcare reform. We're starting to see medical costs begin to go up again, and they drive health insurance rates. So not perfect. My own personal view is that we ought to move to a single payer system, a system where you have one payer for medical care for everybody. You take the profit taking out of the system, you take the administrative costs out of the system, you take inefficiency and waste out of the system. And we see single payer work reasonably well with regard to the Medicare program for seniors. Since its implementation, seniors have had much improved access to medical care. And so we know in every other industrialized country in the world, that's how they do it in various ways. And I think that's what we should do here ultimately in California. But in the meantime, we're in a pitched battle with the Trump administration trying to protect the benefits of healthcare reform as they seek to undermine it, and have been very active in that front, battling the Trump administration, doing everything we can to protect the benefits of healthcare reform that we have in place here in California.
Yeah, Dave, just stick on that subject for a minute. You have a big grassroots following up here in Northern California, and I think a lot of that is for your take on single payer and Medicare for all. I'd like to understand a little more from a city or county perspective what that would do for cities and small business when they no longer have to cover the cost of those employees, and what those budgets would look like from a city or county standpoint if we did have a Medicare for all system. I would think it would help the situation for city and county budgets. Am I naive to think that, or especially with the huge cost of workers' compensation insurance and some of the other things?
There's no question that when fully implemented, single payer would provide tremendous savings to cities and counties and other public agencies that are providing health benefits for their employees. It would also be a big boon for small, medium, and large businesses who, everywhere I travel in California, complain about how expensive health insurance is. I mean, even for large businesses where they have a little more bargaining power with the health insurers and the HMOs, fundamentally, they're really not able to bargain. They have to take the price that's dictated to them, and that price builds in a lot of profit, a lot of inefficiency, a lot of overhead. So there would be substantial savings. It really depends on the generosity of the local government and the business with regard to its current health benefits package. But suffice to say, there would be significant savings and ones that are well worth the effort. Now, in order to fund it, though, you are going to need some additional revenues, and that's been a sticking point in the past, but I don't think that needs to be fatal, and you're going to have to do some things to try to control underlying costs, so that's an important aspect of it also. But again, every other industrialized country in the world has figured this out. The United States has figured it out for the Medicare program, and I'm confident here in California we can figure it out too, and it would be just so much more beneficial, would reduce inefficiency, reduce all of the middle people that are in the middle between you and your physician or your healthcare provider, and that's a benefit as well.
Yeah, well, I was thinking too along the lines of, I'm speaking as a labor worker, and I mean, we might get a raise here and there in subsequent years, but it seems like those are always offset by the health insurance increases that are put down onto us, and we understand that the business or the government agencies end up taking some of that hit. But it's very hard to grow economic, wealth here or get a better salary when continuously those things are offset by the increases to the healthcare.
Absolutely. As I travel around the state, I hear time and time again from both employers and labor organizations that any increase in compensation that might be bargained for or offered to employees gets eaten up by rising health insurance and HMO costs. So that even if you're fortunate enough to be in a union, and in a union that is able to negotiate increases in compensation for you, much of that, if not all of it, gets eaten up in the rising costs of health care and health benefits for workers. And same with non-unionized employers where small, medium, or large are offering, say, health insurance or health benefit packages to their employees. They make a choice between keeping up with the rising cost of health care or putting a little more money into the paycheck of their employees. And increasingly, it's having to put more money into the health care in order to maintain the same level of benefits. And oftentimes, the benefits get cut on top of that to try to cover the rising costs. So it's a huge problem. It's one where there really is no end in sight. The notion that health insurance, health care can function like a purely competitive market, I think is one that we've seen time and time again doesn't work. And part of it is just opacity. If you want to have a market work, you need to have pricing and people need to know what the price of things are. You can't find the price of medical care to save your life right now in California. So how can a market possibly work where price is available, people can make choices, there's competition? It just doesn't function that way. And that's why so many other countries have gone to single payer and why we went to single payer for the Medicare program.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of market and competition, we do have a gripe up here that there isn't a lot of competition. I mean, there's just some companies that just won't come up here to cover people. How would that be addressed in a single payer Medicare for all sort of system in California? Would we get some better competition up here?
Well, you wouldn't have to rely on a decision of a Anthem Blue Cross or a Blue Shield or a Kaiser to come into Northern California under a single payer program, there'd be a single entity that would be responsible for paying for medical care provided by medical providers. And so you wouldn't be at the mercy any longer of the insurer's decision. And sadly, with the new Trump administration, one of the first acts President Trump took was to sign an executive order directing federal agencies not to implement or comply with the Affordable Care Act. And he's done a bunch of other things since then to undermine it. So some number of health insurers have said, that's it, we're out of here. We're not going to participate any longer. So Anthem, for example, pulled out of a lot of areas in the state of California that it was in previously. Under single payer, you wouldn't be at the mercy of the health insurers and the HMOs with regard to whether they want to come into your area or not.
Dave, I'd like to turn, if we could, to asking a little bit about your legal background and your experience in the justice system, because that's obviously relevant to your campaign here to become the next Attorney General of the state. You started your career as a legal aid attorney, which is very interesting, of course, having a very close relationship to folks in need who needed legal advice. So what did that experience tell you about the individual's relationship with the law, the justice system, and how do you think that's going to inform your ability to perform as Attorney General?
I did begin my career, and purposefully so, as a legal aid lawyer, providing free legal assistance to poor families and individuals with a program called Legal Services in Northern California, which has offices in Chico and Redding. My office happened to be in Woodland, and it was a extraordinary experience. I had a chance to represent lower income families and individuals with a whole host of different legal issues, affordable housing, civil rights, public benefits, consumer protection, you name it. And I went into that work because I believe then, and I still believe, that the law can be an important instrument for social and economic justice. And that has been a constant throughout my public service career, whether it was as a legal aid lawyer or working as Janet Reno's special assistant when she was the United States Attorney General, or as a city council member, state assembly member, insurance commissioner, and now ideally Attorney General. The desire to use the law for the advancement of social justice and economic justice has been a constant theme. And I saw firsthand as a legal aid lawyer what a difference you could make. A lot of my work revolved around lawsuits designed to get more affordable housing built and then advocating for more affordable housing policies. And as a result, thousands of additional units were built that provided decent quality affordable housing for families where they didn't have a roof over their head previously. So you can see the difference that this makes for people. And I'm still passionate about that. And I believe as Attorney General, I'll be even better positioned to use the law in a whole host of ways to help Californians with a whole host of challenges they face.
What do you think that or I guess let me ask you, what do you wish that the average layman, Aaron and myself are good examples of this, would know about the possibilities and the limitations of the law to affect our daily lives? I mean, I think that a lot of us who aren't in the legal profession don't really understand the way the law works, other than maybe what we see on TV, which probably isn't that good of a representation. So what do you wish that we all knew as constituents to help us understand what the Justice Department's all about, what the law, the legal ramifications are of society, and what we need to know about that?
Well, we are a nation of laws, and we believe very firmly, and it's in the DNA of our Constitution, we believe very firmly in the rule of law. But the rule of law only can prevail when people will continue to support the rule of law and uphold it. And right now we're in a very strange moment where the President of the United States and his administration are repeatedly making assaults on the rule of law in a variety of different ways. And so I think this is a real test in many ways of our institutions, of our laws, of our belief in the rule of law, as to whether or not these institutions that were created by the founding fathers centuries ago will withstand someone who doesn't believe in the rule of law, who thinks he's above the law, and wants to bend the executive branch and every branch of government to his will. So it's going to be a real test. I'm confident ultimately that the rule of law will prevail, that the institutions will hold firm, but it also places greater responsibility on us as Californians to resist and use the law to resist. Now, there are also limitations to the law. I mean, the law can only advance social and economic justice to the extent that the law speaks to those issues. And so that's why it's also important to be active on the legislative front, whether it's at a municipal level or in a state legislature, or ultimately, if we can take it back, Congress, to pass better laws that better address changing circumstances and address the needs of people. But I think fundamentally what I'd like lay people to know is that the rule of law is critically important. It's essential, but it has to be supported by people in order for it to have a real meaning and real impact. And right now we have a test on our hands as to whether the rule of law will continue to prevail in this country.
Yeah, we see the Attorney General of California being a huge position. You know, the office is always at the forefront of big issues that really affect people's lives, especially in the state of California, especially in a year like 2018. The federal Justice Department is openly hostile to many state policies, and we just like your thoughts on a few of these issues. So I guess we'll start with immigration reform.
So I believe very strongly that as a nation of immigrants, and think about it, other than Native Americans and African Americans who were brought here in chains, each and every one of our forebears is an immigrant. You don't have to go very far back in my family history, a couple generations. There was Gomer Jones who came over from Wales. He was a coal miner. He didn't have any documentation. He wasn't conferred citizenship. He just came over in a boat and made his way to the western hills of Pennsylvania and mined coal. And eventually, decades later, was conferred citizenship. One of our most prized family mementos are his citizenship papers. And my wife's family, Kim Flores, you don't have to go back many generations to find members of her family immigrated here. Each and every one of us can point back to people that immigrated here, usually in an undocumented way without having been conferred permission to do so. So now for the Trump administration to say, well, in this generation, because people are coming from Central American and South American countries, because of the color of their skin, we're not going to let them in, to me is outrageous. So I think immigrants ought to have a path to citizenship. I believe the Dreamers ought to be permitted to stay here. I think there ought to be a clean renewal of DACA. And I'll do everything within my power as Attorney General to protect immigrants. And that includes defending our sanctuary city and sanctuary state laws. As Insurance Commissioner, I mentioned a moment ago, I lead a law enforcement agency. I have law enforcement personnel who work for me. I didn't wait for the passage of SB 54, the sanctuary city, sanctuary state legislation to pass. I instructed them even before passage that we're not going to cooperate with ICE in the deportation of people whose only crime is having come here without documentation. And so as Attorney General, I'll do everything I can to defend our immigrant community.
Well, Dave, let me ask you to clarify that a little bit, if I could, because recently there's been a very interesting controversy down in Orange County about some local communities who are basically fighting California as individual communities and saying that they don't want to support these sanctuary laws here in the state. So the argument that they're making is, well, California is ignoring a federal statute. Why should we not be able to ignore a state statute? Well, how would you respond to that?
Well, California is not ignoring a federal statute. What we're saying is that, to the contrary, immigration is the province of the federal government, but we as a state, whether it's our state law enforcement or local law enforcement that are extensions of the state, are not going to perform the federal government's job for it. And that particularly applies where we're not talking about violent felons. The SB 54 was drafted in a way to make clear that state and local law enforcement will continue to cooperate with ICE with regard to violent felons. But with regard to people whose only crime is having come here without documentation, we're not going to do the job of the federal government and participate in sweeps and roundups and mass deportations of people who are our neighbors, people who are our colleagues, people whose kids go to the same school as our kids. We're just not going to do it. And that's entirely within the province of the state under the 10th Amendment, which reserves all powers not expressly identified in the Constitution or in federal statute to the states. So yes, there are some local governments in Southern California who want to challenge that, and they have the right to file a lawsuit. I don't think they're going to prevail. But until a court says otherwise, SB 54 is the law, and I'm confident we'll enforce it.
Let's talk about another topic that's been very controversial. Difference between the federal Justice Department and California state law is in marijuana policy and recreational marijuana use and medical marijuana use. So what's your thoughts on that dispute? Because there's been certainly, I know that the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, is very, very much anti any kind of substance, including marijuana. Yet California has laws that support recreational marijuana. So how do you work that angle?
Well, one of the grave injustices that has been committed here in California, and I think nationally, is the use of the war on drugs and targeting it in many ways on communities of color and throwing people in prison and jails for very, very long periods of time for non-serious, non-violent drug possessory offenses. And this includes marijuana. I mean, a lot of people have been swept up and put in jail and prisons for long periods of time for possession of marijuana. As a result, communities have been deprived of people, families have been deprived of people, people have been hardened in the jails and prisons, they've been stamped with a felony stamp, and then when they're released, they can't vote, they can't find a job, they can't find housing, and then they reoffend and back they go in. So this is a big problem. And one of the benefits of California's decision to decriminalize marijuana is at least breaking that cycle as it relates to marijuana possessory offenses. So now that the voters have made that decision, I think it's important that we implement it and implement it successfully. What I've been doing as insurance commissioner is working hard to make sure there's insurance available for cannabis businesses. Cannabis businesses now that are licensed in California are legitimate businesses, and I want them to have the same insurance protections as anybody else. So if a consumer walks into a retail facility, if someone works for a cannabis business, if someone's investing in a cannabis business, they have all the insurance protections that any other business or consumer might have. And we've had success in doing that. We've got over 25 writers of what's called surplus lines insurance and the first commercial admitted insurance to write. The decision by Sessions to tear up the Cole Memorandum, which was the memorandum from the Obama administration that said that U.S. attorneys will not prioritize and will essentially not bring investigations and prosecutions against cannabis businesses that are licensed lawfully under state laws. The decision to get rid of that policy, I think, is a bad one, and one that's totally at odds with what we've done here in California. So far, the good news is that the federal government doesn't seem to have begun any of those investigations or prosecutions against licensed cannabis industries, but it is a problem, and it continues to send the wrong message, I think, and a message contrary to what we're trying to do here in California.
Yeah, and let's move to gun control. There's been, I think, some new bills that have come out in the last couple of weeks, and I haven't really been able to keep up. But as far as control, we have some pretty stringent laws in California, at least from what you hear from people up here. And there is a take from people in the North State that, maybe lawmakers in LA and Sacramento aren't looking from a 50,000 foot level at issues that are having in their cities, and maybe the laws and regulations that are put in place are a little bit punitive to people in rural counties, and whether they're trying to protect their livestock or whether they're trying to have home protection. But where are you on some of those issues? And is it time for Northern California to decide that we are in it for our neighbors here, and sometimes you got to make sacrifices to the things we do. We're not immune to it here, Dave. We've had some shootings up here. We've had a mass shooting that could have been much worse than it was. It was forwarded by some teachers at a school in Rancho Tehama County, and but there's certainly a gun culture up here that is resonant with the old West, I guess, and some hard people that don't want to see any type of gun control measure as a slippery slope.
So I think it's important to look at the science and the evidence, and those states that have strong common sense gun laws do much better in terms of the incidence of gun violence in those states that do not. And as you say, California has some of the strongest common sense gun control laws in the nation. As a consequence, compared to other states that don't, on a per capita basis, we have far less gun violence. We're not immune to it, however, and Also, we're not immune to the fact that surrounding states have weaker laws, and individuals can take advantage of that and then come into our state. So I think that these laws are important, and I think it's important as a mechanism to try to reduce gun violence. Now, responsible gun owners who are collectors or have guns for purposes of hunting or other sporting activities, no one's suggesting that the state government should go and take their guns away. But there are increasing efforts to try to restrict availability and make it a little bit harder for people that might cause harm to get a gun, and I think that's appropriate. But in addition to the laws themselves, we have to make sure we're implementing those laws. And one of the important jobs of the Attorney General is administering the Armed Prohibited Persons Database. This is a database under the Office of the Attorney General. And in California, we have a law that says that if you've been adjudicated by a court to be so mentally ill that you're a danger to yourself or others if you have a weapon, or if you've been convicted of a serious felony or misdemeanor and the court has said you really shouldn't have a weapon anymore, or if you're subject to a domestic violence restraining order and a court has said you shouldn't have a gun anymore, well, if you fall into any of those three categories, then you're supposed to surrender your gun. The problem is there's a backlog of close to 10,000 individuals that fall into those three categories that are in this Armed Prohibited Persons Database who have not surrendered their weapons. And it's the responsibility of the Attorney General to make sure that they have surrendered their weapons. And one of the big distinctions between me and the current incumbent is his failure to make sure that that backlog has been reduced. And so were I Attorney General, I would make it a priority to obtain weapons from those that have fallen into these three categories. And again, this is after full due process, after an adjudication. These are either individuals that are so mentally ill, the courts decided they shouldn't have a gun, or they're convicted of serious felonies or misdemeanors, or they're subject to a domestic violence restraining order where a court has decided that because they committed some injury on a domestic partner or spouse, there's a risk that they might hurt that person more and they shouldn't have a gun. And so those 10,000 or so people are a risk in all of our communities across California. And I would make it a priority to make sure that we obtain the surrender of their weapons first and foremost, because they're the ones that pose the greatest threat to themselves or other people.
Dave, let's talk about environmental regulations. So another issue where there's a schism, kind of, I think, between the federal government and the state of California. For instance, there's now the nation, the federal government is permitting, and I believe you can help me with this, offshore drilling off the coast of California. I know it was off the coast of Florida as well, I believe. But yet California does not, I believe, want this. So that's an example of environmental regulations that California wants to, I think, be much more firm on than the federal government. So how do you balance those two concerns? So
the Trump administration is launching an assault on a whole host of different environmental protections that are important to California. You mentioned the president's order directing federal agencies to do rulemakings to open up drilling off our coasts. You mentioned as well their efforts to try to reduce the size of what are called national monuments, or large federal parks that have been established by presidential order. The president has also declared war on the clean air laws, where there's a provision in the clean air law that allows California to set its own California standards, and that's been used to drive standards across the country. The Trump administration's EPA announced they want to go after that. It's a long list. So for each and every one of these, I think there are very good legal bases to challenge what the Trump administration is doing, and certainly as Attorney General, I would do that. But I think it's important to note that the Office of Attorney General is not just challenging the Trump administration. As I mentioned, with regard to the Armed Prohibited Persons Database, there are other important aspects of the job that need to get done and are not getting done right now. One of those is holding ExxonMobil accountable for its years of lying about climate change and telling its shareholders that climate change wasn't real and it wasn't man-made and they need not worry about it, while at the same time their own scientists internally were reaching the opposite conclusion, that climate change is real, it's man-made, and it's going to have an impact on oil prices, and sending communications and memos to the senior leadership of ExxonMobil telling that, while at the same time those senior leaders of ExxonMobil were saying exactly opposite to the public and shareholders. Well, that's a potential breach of their fiduciary obligation to the shareholders. The New York and Massachusetts attorneys generals have opened investigations, subpoenaed documents. They're involved in litigation with ExxonMobil right now. California has not joined that litigation. We should. If I were attorney general, I'd be joining New York and Massachusetts attorneys generals and holding ExxonMobil accountable for its lies and its denial of climate change. I think it's also important to note that there's a distinction not only between myself and the current occupant of the Attorney General's office on this policy issue, but I'm refusing to take any contributions from oil companies, and he's taking contributions from oil companies. So I think it's important to recognize that the battle is not just with the Trump administration. There are important other issues that need to be addressed that aren't being addressed that I would plan to address as Attorney General.
Yeah, Dave, you're from Chicago. I mean, you were born in Chicago. And, during the 2016 election, we saw the national wing of the GOP kind of use Chicago as a political tool against Obama policies or against the administration. And now I kind of see things as setting up as the Republican National Party kind of using California as a tool to try to have a cultural divide in the country about, I guess you're from the land of Lincoln and I am too. And then they're trying to paint California as the land of liberalism and how you don't want the rest of the country to become like California. Oh my goodness. And there's even been some terrible calls on, in social media and everything for California to secede from the rest of the country and that it's just a terrible thing. I mean, it's really these attacks are, we're part of the United States and we're a great part. I mean, we have a huge boost to the national economy and other states were actually helping out by fund their negative, their negative budgets. Yeah. But do you see this as a political tool that these attacks or these vicious attacks on California? And are they, is there more to come? And, I guess just how do you feel about, sort of what's been happening?
Well, I think President Trump and his administration are politicizing every aspect of federal law and federal policy. And you're right, there's no question that they're attacking California for largely political reasons. I also think that they simply don't like the policies that we've enacted, but it's largely political. Witness this latest call for the National Guard to be deployed on the border. The illegal border crossings are at the lowest level that they've been going back decades. And one has to wonder, given all of the additional resources the Trump administration is throwing into the Border Patrol, why do we need to have the National Guard deployed? His first idea was to try to put the military down there, and then someone pointed out that the posse comitatus law prevents that. So now he is resorting to the National Guard. And what he wants is a photograph of armed guardsmen and armed guardswomen along the border, I guess, to send some sort of message to his political base about how tough he is. That's a misuse of the brave men and women in our National Guard. And I think it's just another example of ways that he's politicizing important public policy. And I think it's only going to get worse, particularly as the midterms approach and as more and more aspects of the electorate are rejecting Trumpism and rejecting the extreme right. We've seen this in a number of special elections already in places across the country. And I think as they get more desperate, unfortunately, the Trump administration is going to do even more extreme things. And so we're going to have to be on our guard and push back and do everything we can to resist that. At the same time, pointing out that California works. I mean, we have some of the highest levels of economic growth, lowest levels of unemployment, greatest levels of job creation. You pointed out in your question that we're a net donor to the federal budget. For every dollar in taxes that we pay, we only get back about 75 cents. That other money's going to these other conservative states that can't seem to balance their own budgets and are in great disarray. So that's not to say everything's perfect here. We have a lot of poverty. We have a lot of issues of social and economic injustice that we need to work on. But comparatively speaking, I think we're doing a lot better than a lot of other places.
Let's talk about justice and injustice, because, of course, we all remember just recently happened the terrible shooting of Stephon Clark in Sacramento. Of course, you're not you're not in charge of the Sacramento County Sheriff. We understand that, of course. But what do you think about the way that police forces across the state of California interact with their citizenry? Here in Butte County, in Chico, we're beginning to see now social workers beginning to be embedded with police officers to try to address some of these situations that may come up with people that perhaps in many cases are mentally ill, and the police will engage with them without the training to perhaps de-escalate those situations without violence. So I guess my question really is that perhaps a good idea to be adopted statewide? And what are some other ways we can help to kind of de-escalate these terrible situations where people get shot for holding a cell phone?
I think it's a very good idea. I think, unfortunately, the police have been asked to be mental health counselors and mental health treatment providers, which they're ill-equipped to do. That's not their training. That's not their professional experience. And so ideas like you've described in Butte County, where social workers or mental health treatment and counselors are deployed to situations that are occurring involving mentally ill people, or accompanying police as they go about their business, I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, we shouldn't be asking the police to do that job. And sadly, we're seeing a rise in the incidence of homelessness and a rise in the proportion of the homeless who are mentally ill. And so as a consequence, there's a need to change, I think, how we go about helping them. And one way is not just throwing them into jail, but rather providing them with services they need and having the appropriate professionals provide those services. I think we've got to look beyond that, though, to overall our policing policies and police training. And it's very difficult. There's no question. To be a law enforcement officer is a challenging job. You're putting yourself at risk day in, day out. At the same time, the Stephon Clark shooting and all the other examples of shootings, whether it's a person of color or a person of color who happens to be mentally ill or any variation thereof, demonstrate that we've got a real problem on our hands. And I think one thing to look to is changing police policy and police practices and training so that the focus is on de-escalation and avoiding escalating a situation to where you end up with gun violence. And so I think there's a lot to be done in that area. I also think that all of us approach our daily lives with backgrounds, experiences, culture, history that informs how we interact with each other. And despite our best efforts to make sure we're not engaging in or interacting in a way that manifests bias, it can creep in. And so there are these implicit biases, unfortunately, that creep into all of our interactions with one another. And I think it's really important to be mindful of that and to address that. So as a leader of a statewide law enforcement agency myself, the head of the Department of Insurance, where I have law enforcement officers, the year before last, I initiated unconscious bias training for our law enforcement personnel. Nobody told me I had to do it. There's no law that directed me to do it. I just thought it was the right thing to do. And in fact, we extended that to all of our employees. And so the purpose of that training was to get our law enforcement personnel, as well as all of our personnel, thinking about the ways in which unconscious bias might creep into their interactions with other people, whether it's the public or coworkers or anybody else for that matter, and to think about ways in which to try to mitigate against that. And I think that's particularly important for law enforcement personnel as well. So I think we've got a lot of work to do here. I think as Attorney General, what I would do is push really hard for changes in policing policy, changes in training, implicit bias training, but also use the Office of Attorney General to hold accountable those that are engaged in civil rights violations. I think it's noteworthy that in the entire history of the Office of Attorney General, going back decades, there have been only 3 civil rights investigations of law enforcement agencies ever initiated. 2 were initiated in Kamala Harris's tenure, and 1 was initiated in the tenure of Jerry Brown. And so being willing to, where the evidence and law supports it, to hold accountable those that are violating civil rights, I think is an important aspect of the job and something that I'm prepared to do.
We had sort of a similar situation happen here in Chico with the shooting of Desmond Phillips, a young black man who's actually his father called to get support from police of his son having a mental health issue. And again, the amount of shots fired, really spells out to people an excessive use of force. I mean, 20 some, 14, I don't know how many shots were fired in that. And we have not been immune to bad policing. We've had an officer in Paradise who was, found guilty of shooting a suspect, and with video evidence of that. I guess I have a real layman's look at this, and I'm not a police officer. I very much respect the police. I deal with code enforcement sometimes in my job, and I don't have a weapon, and usually because of my de-escalation training and stuff, I can get people to comply without having to go to certain levels, just based on that training. When I see basically like the shooting range for police officers in that training, I mean, they basically have a torso area coming at them, and they're practicing on emptying a clip into that torso. I mean, shouldn't that be a full body graphic of a person, and shouldn't they be, if they are expert marksmen, shouldn't they be looking to preserve life? Because when I think about the job of a police officer, I think about protecting and serving. And when I think about the rule of law, I think about rights of innocent until proven guilty, and even protecting the life of someone that you're possibly taking into custody who has broken the law. So, I mean, are we getting that down to that minute level of how we're going to be doing policing in the future, and maybe taking out a knee or taking out a shoulder is better under the rule of law to preserve somebody being innocent until proven guilty?
Well, I think before you get to the point of the confrontation where you're shooting, you want to train the police and have policies in place that are designed to try to explore all other available means of de-escalating the situation to avoid the use of that kind of force. And so the objective of changing policies and retraining is to try to avoid getting to the circumstance where an officer is discharging his or her weapon. And so you could imagine, say, if someone is suspected of committing a misdemeanor and breaking into car windows or home windows, and you know where that individual is, rather than confronting him or her, cordoning off the area, letting the situation settle down a little bit, and then seeking the surrender of that individual voluntarily as opposed to confronting him. That's just one example. Yeah. It is the case, though, that it's very difficult to hit a knee or hit an arm or do the sorts of things that you see in the movies in Hollywood. And so officers are trained to fire at center mass, because if someone does have a weapon and is threatening them or other people that the officer is trying to protect, other lives, other innocent lives that you're trying to protect, the goal is to stop that individual from committing that harm. So I think that it's very difficult to point to what should be shot at as a way of trying to minimize harm. Rather, I think you've got to start a lot earlier in looking at the development of confrontations and what could be done to try to avoid the discharge of the weapon in the first instance. I think that's where the most productive energy ought to be directed. And I think, ideally is a place where we could get a lot of significant benefit by focusing on that area.
And Dave, we're coming up to the end of our segment. Thank you so much for joining us, of course. But before we let you go, I want to let you get this in because I think it's very important. In February, and Aaron was there at the convention down in San Diego. You won 56% of the votes of the delegates there, versus 42%, as I understand, for the incumbent Attorney General Xavier Becerra. So, firstly, kind of a two-parter. What does that result, do you think, say about your ability to connect with the grassroots of the party here in the state? And secondly, given that an incumbent holds certain inherited advantages in a race such as this, how would you draw the distinction between yourself and incumbent Attorney General Becerra?
Well, we were very pleased at the state party convention to win with 56% of the vote, and those delegates come from all corners of our great state, and they are people representing all religions, all ethnicities, all races, all genders, and so we were very excited to have such a broad cross-section of support, and it was an upset for the appointed Attorney General, who only got 42% of the vote, and I think it speaks to the breadth of support that I have throughout the state, and the strength of the coalition we've assembled in support of my candidacy for Attorney General. There are big differences in this race. We've touched on some of them. One of the big ones is my not taking money from the oil industry, not taking money from the insurance industry, not taking money from the tobacco industry. My opponent is taking campaign contributions from the oil industry, from the insurance industry, and from big tobacco. That last one's particularly surprising because the Attorney General's office has a unit within it that's responsible for overseeing the tobacco litigation settlements that were obtained through the Office of Attorney General against the big tobacco companies for a product that has injured so many people. And so to take money from them is just something that I would never do. There's also big policy differences. I'm campaigning actively on a platform of criminal justice reform. We've talked about some of that already, but in addition, what we haven't had a chance to talk about is my strong focus on reentry and rehabilitation programs for people that are coming out of the jails and the prisons. I think it's absolutely essential that we provide them with mental health treatment, substance use treatment, job training, jobs, and affordable housing, both because we want them to be successful as they come out, but also it's in our interest, in our community's interest, to make sure they're successful and they don't reoffend. If we don't provide very, very strong, expanded reentry and rehabilitation programs for people coming out of the system, they are going to reoffend, they're going to re-victimize, and we're going to have a mess on our hands. And so I want to focus on that in a very, very direct and concrete way as the next Attorney General. I think it's very, very important, and it's a way to make sure that we maintain the public safety gains and the reductions in incidents of crime that we've had since the 90s. The other differences as well, we talked about single payer, that's a significant difference too. So there's some very, very substantial differences in experience. I've been practicing law for the last 30 years. My opponent was in Congress since 1992, had an inactive bar license, has not practiced law in that time. I've been leading a statewide law enforcement agency the last 7.5 years. He's not had the opportunity to do that for anywhere near that duration of time. So we're pointing out these differences to the voters. We're confident that voters will understand the importance of having an Attorney General that is more aligned with voters of California, but also one with these sort of backgrounds and experience and qualifications. And we're excited about the upcoming primary and excited about the chance to communicate with voters across the state.
Yeah, Dave, I really appreciate you coming on. I think one of the reasons that, personally, I voted for you as a delegate is, your stance on the death penalty. And I don't want to give the impression that to people that you haven't been up to the North State, because you have. You've campaigned up here. You've been to cities like Paradise, I believe, and Chico and some other places. You've met with groups up here and talked. But one thing I want to get to you before you leave is social media. And a lot of us are on Facebook, and we feel like, as far as consumer protection, that, we've had our information stolen. And you've had a lot of wins as an insurance commissioner, but I'd like to have you talk just for a little bit about protecting consumers as far as our online information and kind of Facebook's and others' responsibilities to also do that.
Well, I agree. And what we're learning with regard to Facebook allowing Cambridge Analytica to steal tens of millions of Facebook users' private information is outrageous. And so were I Attorney General, I would be with the New York and Massachusetts Attorney Generals opening up a full-blown investigation of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. My opponent, the appointed Attorney General, just sent Facebook a letter with some questions. I don't think that's enough. I think that Facebook needs to be investigated for potential violations of California's privacy laws and consumer protection laws. And I have had a lot of experience in this regard as insurance commissioner, time and time again, suing insurance companies successfully to protect consumers or defending against their lawsuits, challenging consumer protection regulations. So I know how to use the law effectively to protect consumers, and I'm not afraid to take on these big fights. I think, unfortunately, the tech industry is a very powerful industry in California, and some attorneys general are unwilling to hold them accountable. I don't have that hesitation. I think that if large corporations are violating the trust of their consumers, their users, they ought to be held accountable. And that certainly has been my approach as insurance commissioner, and that will be my approach as attorney general. And one of the endorsements I'm really proud of is an endorsement from the California Federation of Consumers, or rather Consumer Federation of California, which is an umbrella group of the major consumer protection nonprofit organizations across the state, and they've endorsed my candidacy for Attorney General in recognition of my strong consumer protection record.
Dave, in the last minute or two we have here before we let you go, just a quick question. Let's say you could sit down and have a cup of coffee with Donald Trump and or Jeff Sessions. I don't even know if those guys sit down and have a cup of coffee together these days, but let's say you sat down with those guys. What would you tell them? What would you want to tell them about California?
Am I allowed to wear a wire?
Yes, but Trump's going to have a bigger cup, I imagine.
Yeah, you might frisk me as I came into the Oval Office. Well, I guess in all seriousness, were I to have an audience with the president, I would tell him in a very straightforward and direct way that California is not going to be bullied, that we're a state of innovators, of people from all parts of the world, of people that represent different religions, ethnicities, and races. And we're stronger for that. It's a hallmark of our success economically and otherwise, and we're not going to let ourselves be bullied. I think that one of the hallmarks of this administration is the belief of the president that he can bully individuals, that he can bully whole states, and I would tell him we're not going to be bullied, and we're going to stand up to you, and we're going to hold you accountable, and ultimately we will win. And so I would just be very straight and direct with him about that, so that there was just no question as to where I stood and where California stands. And what he needs to understand about us is that we're not going to be bullied. We're going to protect our people. We're going to protect the values that we hold dear. And we're going to resist, where necessary, any incursions on those values.
Well, Dave Jones, we just are losing your Skype right here at the end of the interview, which is perfect because we're done. Thank you so much.
A true fighter with a champion's resume. I really appreciate you coming on the show, Dave Jones.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, giving us some of your time today, Dave. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very, very much. I've enjoyed the interview.
Thank you, guys. Well, that's our show. And again, thanks to Dave Jones for joining us. Don't forget, NorCal News Now is available wherever you download your podcast, so check us out and subscribe. We can also be found on Facebook at NorCal News Now, where you can post your comments and suggestions for upcoming podcast topics and guests. So thanks all of you for listening in. We'll be back at you soon with another episode of NorCal News Now. So long.